Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The Sophists by W.K.C. Guthrie. And this book was originally published in 1969, but it was published as, not really as itself, it was published as a part of a larger work, which was Volume 3 of the History of Greek Philosophy. Guthrie wrote a multi-part History of Greek Philosophy, and this was Volume 3. This and another section called Socrates. And then, so this was constituted like half of Volume 3. And then a couple years later, 71, this was published on its own. And it's a decent defense of the Sophists. I think the Sophists really get short shrift. They get underestimated, their contribution. And a lot that we know about the Sophists comes from Plato. And Plato was kind of using the Sophists as his foil, the people who would get consistently defeated by Socrates in the dialogues were often Sophists. Much of Plato's argument was against the Sophists. So if we take Plato as our primary source of what the Sophists were all about, we're going to get a biased, skewed version. We're going to get the version of them that Plato sets up so that Socrates can defeat them in the dialogue. There's not an awful lot that we have from the Sophists directly. There is some. Really, Plato's works constitute a huge portion of what we have of the ancient world, which is why we constantly go, one of the reasons we constantly go to Plato for knowledge of these things. We just don't have all that much left of the writings of the Sophists. Oftentimes just fragments like the Pre-Socratics, or mentions in Plato or other writers who have written about them. Chapter 4 of this book is called The Nomos, Physis, Antithesis in Morals and Politics. And Chapter 4 is the one that I want to focus on this episode. There are other sections like equality and the relativity of values and rhetoric and philosophy, other good sections, rationalist theories of religion, lots of good content. But Chapter 4 is what I want to focus on. There's a little bit in the earlier chapters, a section from Chapter 1, the introduction, and then a section from Chapter 2, topics of the day. And he doesn't mean topics of the day when, of 1969 when he's writing. He means the topics of the day of the era of the Sophists. What were people talking about in general in the Greek world in that time? What were the topics of conversation that were popular conversation topics at that time? So I've got a section from Chapter 1 and one from Chapter 2. I'm going to skip over Chapter 3, what is a sophist? And then I have the rest of my sections are all from Chapter 4, the Nomos, Physis, Antithesis. Nomos and Physis are concepts, Nomos being a rough translation of law or custom, and Physis a rough translation of nature. And the contrast or distinction or separation, attempting to find the separation or advocate for the supremacy of one or the other, of either custom or nature, either nomos or physis. And I think that's interesting because, my show, Nature and the Nation, is about the intersection of naturalism or physis, or something related to physis. Naturalism, nature, and the nation. The nation is like the political entity, the custom, the tradition, the social component, the artifice of nationhood. and the intersection of these concepts, one of which could be similar to or related to Physis, and the other one, Nomos. And as we saw in the last episode, Nomos and law and custom were in early stages really related to boundaries, dispensations, quadrants, sections of the world that were the domain of this people or that people, or this function or that function. The establishment of boundaries really being the cornerstone of civilization. So this comes back to some of the stuff that we talked about in the last episode as well. This chapter talks a little bit about ananke, necessity. Doesn't talk about fate specifically, but in some portions here and there relates back to things that we've been talking about thus far in the show. And I'm going to start here with the section. I'm going to read, like in all my episodes, a few sections out loud and have some comments. Quite a few sections that I want to read for this show. None of them are super long. The first one here is from the introduction, when he talks a little bit about the pre-Socratics, just mentioning the way in which the Sophists and their ideas spring out of the ideas of the pre-Socratics, or are at least related to the ideas of the pre-Socratics. There's a sort of continuity here. Anyway, here he says, quote, "The pre-Socratics may fairly be said to have been preoccupied with the nature of reality and its relation to sensible phenomena. This question of the relation between reality and appearance remains at the root of things, and in one form or another constitutes the fundamental difference between rival philosophies. On the one hand, we have a complex of ideas whose basis may be loosely summed up in such terms as empiricism, positivism, phenomenalism, individualism, relativism, and humanism. Appearances are constantly shifting from one moment to the next, and between one individual and another, and they themselves constitute the only reality. In morals, this leads to a situational ethics, an emphasis on the immediately practical, and a distrust of general and permanent rules and principles. Such rules or principles could remain valid only if instituted by some divine power, and religious belief, along with many other hitherto unquestioned traditions, are challenged on the grounds that they cannot be verified by positive evidence. This outlook, in its turn, is opposed by the attempt to restore, with philosophical justification, a belief in absolute standards and permanent and unvarying truths existing above and unaffected by sensible phenomena and individual actions and events. We may call it, using similarly evocative but as yet undefined terms, absolutism, idealism, or transcendentalism. The first view is typified by the sayings of Protagoras, earliest and greatest of the Sophists, that man is the measure of all things, and the existence of God's an undemonstrable assumption. The second is rooted in the teaching of Socrates, but culminates later in Plato's ideal theory, according to which concepts such as justice and beauty, as well as identity and equality and many others, have an existence apart from the human mind, as independent and unvarying standards to which human perceptions and human actions can and must be referred. With this goes naturally a view of the world as the product of divine intelligence. It is remarkable how many arguments that might be thought to be ethical or political, and so to deal with purely practical matters, depend, in fact, on much deeper philosophical issues. This is nonetheless true because the men of action who put them into practice may not always be aware of it. And often the connection is, in fact, a fully conscious one. Politics and morals, general theories of human nature, metaphysics and epistemology cannot be separated. On the surface, we may have political differences about the relative merits of monarchy and republicanism, democracy and totalitarianism, and the general question of where sovereignty should lie, whether in the hands of one man, a select aristocracy, or the whole people. We have questions demanding immediate action, of slavery and its abolition, of colonial rule, of race relations. Below this is a level of ideas which, while still remaining on the human plane, are more abstract and theoretical, raising fundamental questions of human nature. Are all men naturally equal? Is the existence of rulers and subjects, masters and servants, merely a matter of practical convenience, or is it grounded in eradicable natural differences? In studying the various answers that have been given to these questions, the historian will often find that their explanation lies at a third, still deeper level. They rest on assumptions about the nature of reality and the workings of the universe, determining man's position within it, on the issues of divine government versus chance, a cosmos whose members are all organically related, as opposed to a collection of unrelated parts thrown together at random. End quote. So he talks a little bit about the pre-Socratics there, but he's talking about two concepts. He says that the pre-Socratics were obsessed with the nature of reality, and out of the question about the nature of reality, two concepts arose. And we saw this sort of way back in Nietzsche's philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, with the three figures of Anaximander, Heraclitus, and Parmenides. And Anaximander really kind of asking the fundamental questions of philosophy. And growing out of Anaximander were the ideas of Heraclitus and Parmenides. Heraclitus much more of the pluralist, and Parmenides much more of the monist. Again, those are not absolute poles. They're neither of them, I think, my opinion, are absolutely dedicated to their opposition of the one and the many. But in a rough sort of way, these two views come about. One of them, he says, loosely summed up in such terms as empiricism, positivism, phenomenalism, individualism, relativism, and humanism. Situational ethics. He says that leads to morals, that leads to a situational ethics and emphasis on the immediately practical, and a distrust of general and permanent rules and principles. Each situation calling for its own unique solution, skeptical of rules, absolute rules that can be applied across the board, moral rules. That's really the pluralist, the empiricist, the pluralist. As William James would call this division back in Pragmatism, early on, episode, what was that, 9? The tough-minded and tender-minded. The tough-minded being the one who believes in practical facts on the ground, and the tender-minded being the one that believes in the lofty ideals tending toward absolutism versus empiricism. This division that seems to run through philosophy from start to finish. So we have, like Heraclitus and Parmenides, these two different views. And he says that so much of modern politics really can be boiled down to different ideas about the nature of reality. To what extent modern political differences can really be boiled down to monists versus pluralists, I don't know, but it's an interesting thought experiment to ask yourself how much of modern politics relates back to those things, but to try to put a finer point on it is actually sort of difficult, because who believes what? I tend to think that there is an aspect of monism and unity and structure and single defined fact or absolute way that the world is, but there's also in our day-to-day affairs a lot of situational circumstances whose deeper connection to the absolute, meaning of the universe or what have you is, let's say, fuzzy, and situations have to be dealt with as they come to you and can't be just dealt with as a part of the larger whole. So seems like smart politics adapts to both of these concepts, because it has to deal with the world as we take it, and as we take it, there's a little bit of both, right? A little bit of monism and a little bit of relatedness of one thing to the other, and also a little bit of separateness of one thing to the other. I don't think it can be, our modern politics can be boiled down into, well, one side is this and the other side is that. Everything being very complicated. Anyway, let's keep moving. He talks a little about unwritten laws. And, here we're sort of talking about maybe something that might be considered more on the absolutist side, that there's a singular unwritten law of the universe that applies in all cases. One people has this set of laws, another people has that set of laws, the customs and creations of man, the laws that are on the books, and then there's an unwritten law that applies everywhere, and that's the laws of the gods or the laws of the universe or the laws of nature. And those are more transcendent than the written laws of man. Following sort of along this absolutist, monist versus pluralist, empiricist dichotomy. Regarding the unwritten laws, he says, quote, "Once the view had gained currency that laws, customs, and conventions were not part of the immutable order of things, it was possible to adopt very different attitudes towards them. On the one hand, Protagoras could argue that accepted canons of good behavior, including some restraint on selfish appetites and consideration for others, although not an original and essential part of human nature, were necessary for the preservation of society, and life in societies was necessary for actual survival. At the other extreme is the rampant individualism of those like Plato's Callicles, who maintained that ideas of law and justice were merely a device of the majority of weaklings to keep the strong man, who is nature's just man, from his rightful place. Nomos and Physis were enemies, and right was on the side of Physis. The sophist Antiphon drew an elaborate contrast between the works of Nomos and those of Physis, the former being unnecessary and artificial curbs imposed on nature by human agreement, the latter necessary and of natural origin. In the idea that laws are a matter of human agreement, covenants made by the citizens, as Hippias called them, instead of divinely sanctioned, we have the essence of the theory of the social compact, or contract, which was developed especially in Europe of the 17th and 18th centuries. In the eyes of Callicles, it condemned them, whereas Critias, through the mouth of Sisyphus in his play of that name, represented the invention of law as an important step on the road from men's originally disorderly and brutish life to civilization. An unequivocal statement of the contractual theory of law is ascribed by Aristotle to Lycophron, a pupil of Gorgias, and in its historical form, as a theory of the origin of law, it is clearly stated by Glaucon in the Republic as a current view which he would like to see refuted. Besides laws in the ordinary sense, contemporary opinion recognized the existence of unwritten laws, and the relation between the two illustrates well the transitional nature of this period of thought. For some, the phrase denoted certain eternal moral principles, universally valid and overruling the positive laws of men, because their origin was from the gods. This conception is best known from the splendid lines of Sophocles in the Antigone, where Antigone defends the burial of her dead brother, contrary to the edict of Creon, by declaring, "It was not Zeus or justice who decreed these nomoi among men, nor did I deem your proclamation so mighty that you, a mortal, could overthrow the sure, unwritten laws of the gods." End quote. So he closes out there with a mention of the play Antigone. Now this is from chapter 2, Topics of the Day. So that's why he's kind of talking about this as an issue that people were talking about at that time. There was a common discussion about unwritten laws versus the laws of men. The laws of men being some decrying them. He mentions Callicles, Plato's Callicles, who denounces laws and justice as a device of the majority of weaklings to keep the strong man, whose nature's just man, from his rightful place. ways to keep powerful people down is the nature of law and justice, for the majority of weaklings to keep strong men from taking over. And so some will view Nomos and Physis as enemies. So Callicles is on the side of Physis. He says Nomos and Physis were enemies and right was on the side of Physis. That's Callicles' position. Callicles is a partisan of Physis, that Nomos and convention is just to keep the strong man who is strong by nature, who is strong by Physis, nature's just man, the powerful man by nature, to keep him down. That is the conflict between Nomos and Physis. And so they did see it as a sort of conflict between these two things. Some would argue that Nomos was an essential part of civilization. Critias, he says, Critias, through the mouth of Sophists, in his play of that name, represented the invention of law as an important step on the road from men's originally disorderly and brutish life to civilization. So some partisans, like Critias, a partisan of Nomos, says that custom is a good thing, and we have developed further into civilization from brutishness by developing our customs and civilization and norms of human society. So the point here is that the concept of written law versus the unwritten law of the gods was a regular topic of conversation at that time, a topic of the day. Now, let's move into chapter 4, which is where most of my sections are, and this is the chapter that's specifically called the Nomos Physis Antithesis in Morals and Politics. So we're continuing on this conflict between Nomos and Physis, between custom and nature. So here he says, quote, the two terms Nomos, plural nomoi, and Physis are keywords. In the 5th and 4th centuries, one might rather say catchwords of Greek thought. In earlier writers, they do not necessarily appear incompatible or antithetical, but in the intellectual climate of the 5th century, they came to be commonly regarded as opposed and mutually exclusive. What existed by Nomos was not by Physis, and vice versa. It is with this use of the terms that we shall now be chiefly concerned. The meaning of Physis emerges from a study of the pre-Socratics. It can safely be translated nature, though when it occurs in conjunction with Nomos, the word reality will sometimes make the contrast more immediately clear. Nomos, for the men of classical times, is something that is believed in, practiced, or held to be right. Originally, something that is apportioned, distributed, or dispensed. That is to say, it presupposes an acting subject, believer, practitioner, or apportioner, a mind, from which the nomos emanates. Naturally, therefore, people had different nomoi, but so long as religion remained an effective force, the devising mind could be the gods. And so there could be nomoi that were applicable to all mankind. Human laws are sustained by the one divine law, said Heraclitus. And for Hesiod, Zeus has laid down a law for all men, that unlike the beasts, they should possess justice. This conception persisted in the sophistic age. Even the rationalist Thucydides can speak of the self-seeking party politicians of his day as partners in crime rather than observers of the divine law. It appears also in the unwritten laws of Sophocles' Antigone, which are divine and everlasting, and which no mortal can successfully defy, as Creon learns too late. But when belief in gods is undermined, and they are no longer current coin, this universal authority for nomos no longer exists. Then the phrase unwritten law takes on a new and more sinister meaning, appropriate to the political realism of the age. The earlier history of the terms nomos and physis is interesting but has been told more than once. We have now reached the point where a new generation has divorced nomos from physis, as what is artificially contrived from what is natural, and sometimes what is false, though commonly believed, from what is true. The latter sense of nomos we have met and philosophical contemporaries of the Sophists. Empedocles denying birth and destruction, but confessing that he conforms to Nomos by using the terms, and Democritus declaring that sensible qualities exist only in Nomos. However, in the Sophists, historians and orators of the day, and in the tragedian Euripides, another spokesman of the New Thought, the antithesis was more commonly invoked in the moral and political spheres. Here, its more important uses are two. 1. Usage or custom based on traditional or conventional beliefs as to what is right or true. 2. Laws formally drawn up and passed, which codify right usage and elevate it into an obligatory norm backed by the authority of the state. The first was the earlier use, but was never lost sight of, so that for the Greeks, law, however much it might be formulated in writing and enforced by authority, remained dependent on custom or habit. The law, wrote Aristotle, has no power to compel obedience besides the force of custom. To some extent, this remains true in any society. End quote. So now we see how here he's saying that in the Greek world, in the era of the Sophists, there was a conflict. People understood there to be a conflict between Nomos and Physis, and a relation perhaps between Nomos and the gods, but also an understanding of Nomos as the ways of man. And beginning to there was a sort of critique of Nomos, and this was something that developed over time, perhaps, not in the era of the earliest Greek thought, not in the era of, perhaps Homer, but later in the era of the Sophists, the idea that Nomos was perhaps false and Physis was more true. Nomos was something that was just convention and that was disparaged. Thus, it was like, well, this isn't true, but I'm going to go ahead and speak this way on account of Nomos, on account of custom, is what Empedocles says, and then Democritus saying that sensible qualities exist only in Nomos. In other words, they're not real, they just seem to be real. What seems to be, what people consider to be true, even if it's not true, or even though it's not true. Or perhaps on account of the fact that it's not true is why it's considered Nomos rather than Physis. It's only thought to be true. And this distinction between nature and custom, has political and moral consequences. So moving on from there, he talks a little bit about the mythology of the concept of Nomos and where it comes from. And he says, quote, "Technical sagacity is innate in man from the beginning, for in the myth it is bestowed by Prometheus at the moment when the first men see the light. It is only another expression for the practical intelligence, which is the first divine gift of Euripides and Aeschylus. Original also was the instinct for worship, because, as the myth puts it, men share in the divine. This they would do both in the sense that reason was the gift of Prometheus, a divine being, and because the possession of reason was thought to be a mark of kinship with the gods. Protagoras himself probably recognized worship as something peculiar and perhaps necessary to man, without committing himself on the existence of its object. Using their native ingenuity, men soon provided themselves with food, houses, and clothing, and learned to speak, but they still lived scattered without cities, because, although they had the craftsman's art, they lacked the political art. Consequently, many were killed by wild beasts, against which the only defense for the physically weaker human species lay in combined action. Fearing, therefore, that the whole race would be wiped out, Zeus, in the story, sent Hermes to bring men two moral virtues, eidos and dike, to make political order possible and create a bond of friendship and union. Dike is a sense of right or justice. Eidos, a more complicated quality combining roughly a sense of shame, modesty, and respect for others. It is not far from conscience. These gifts are not to be restricted to selected individuals, as with the arts, where one can be a doctor, another a musician, and so on, and life be conducted on a principle of division of labor. All must share them, because there could never be cities if only a few shared in these virtues as in the arts. Even Zeus, however, cannot ensure that they are universal, for they were in no part of the original nature of man. So he adds the rider that, if anyone prove incapable of acquiring them, he must be put to death, as a cancerous growth in the body politic. Zeus's decree stands for what, in the non-mythical anthropologies and in Protagoras' mind, was the work of time, bitter experience, and necessity. The story teaches two things about the political virtues. A, in the civilized world, they are possessed to some degree by everybody, but B, they were not innate in man from the beginning. In the explanation following the myth, he takes up both these points. The first one justifies the Athenians in demanding expertise in the technical arts, but not in the art of politics, for which the prime requisites are justice and moderation. Everyone, in fact, believes that these virtues are shared by all. A man entirely without an artistic gift, say music, is a commonplace, but a man entirely without moral qualities could not lead a human life, and anyone who declared that this was his own case would be thought mad. If Socrates ever met such a one, who, ex hypothesi, would be living in isolation, without education, courts of justice, laws, or any other of the restraints of civilized life, he would regard the most hardened criminals of Athens as virtuous by comparison. Secondly, however, though the Athenians, like everyone else, believe that all have some share of the political virtues, they do not think of them as innate or automatic, but as acquired by teaching and effort. These therefore correspond in reality to the decree of Zeus in the myth. The education starts in infancy with mother, nurse, and father, and is continued by schoolmasters, and in adult life by the state, which provides in its laws a pattern of how to live. Moreover, the citizens prompt each other, for it is in our interests that our neighbors should understand the rules of organized social life. In this continuous process, it is difficult to single out a class of teachers of virtue, but this is no more proof that it cannot be taught than the lack of instructors in our native tongue would prove the same about speech. End quote. Okay, so here we have some discussion of the myth of Nomos and the myth of social behavior and the myth of custom. And he says that he starts off by saying technical sagacity is innate in man from the beginning because it is bestowed upon Prometheus at the moment when men first see the light. It seems as though like as soon as men become humans, they have some sort of technical capacity. But they're not. It's not a native part of humans to have moral behavior or social behavior. That in the beginning, people had they provided themselves food, houses, and clothing, and learned to speak, but they still lived scattered without cities because they had the craftsman's art, but they didn't have the political art. And so they were in what would be like war of all against all, like Hobbes talks about, similar in this ancient myth. He says, consequently, many were killed by wild beasts, and the only defense for the physically weaker human species lay in combined action. So Zeus was worried that the whole race would be wiped out. He sent Hermes with two moral virtues, Eidos and Dike. Dike is a sense of right or justice. Eidos is a more complicated quality, combining roughly a sense of shame, modesty, and respect for others. And we saw Eidos in Karl Karenyi's book, Religion of the Greeks and Romans. And it's sort of like shame understood as a virtue. Like, you should feel shame on being in a shameful position. If you're in a shameful position and feel no shame on account of it, then you're lacking a certain virtue of shamefulness, of feeling shame, right? That's something that you should feel, and that modifies your behavior to not allow yourself to be put in a shameful position. That's sort of a moral virtue, and that's a component of adhering to the norms and common behaviors of society. And dike, which is to engage in fair, just behavior. Just what justice is and what just behavior is certainly a whole topic of conversation of its own. But the idea here is that those moral virtues came a little after the fact from Zeus. And the idea also is that some things like music, some people might be good at music, but if I'm not good at music, that's no big deal. If I'm not good at this particular craft or that particular craft, if I'm not, skilled at certain things, that's okay. Whereas if I were unskilled in basic moral virtues, I would live a life worse than the worst criminal. Everybody takes some share in having basic moral virtues in order to live in a society. It's a widespread thing. And he says that Zeus has decreed that if anybody doesn't have these moral virtues, they should be put to death as a cancerous growth in the body politic. He says, even Zeus, however, cannot ensure that they are universal, for they were no part of the original nature of man. So anyone who doesn't have them has to be put to death. They're supposed to belong to everybody. They're supposed to be widespread, but they're not part of our original fundamental nature. And so our civilizational ways did come after our biological ways. In truth, human society is antecedent to our biology as mammalian creatures. And that's part of the justification of Athenian democracy, that all people participated in to some extent, and it's not really the sort of thing where there are so-called experts. Often we find these so-called moral experts are no more moral than the average person. Now, in the ancient Greek world, there were people who were, partisans of Nomos, and people who were partisans of Physis. And one of the partisans of Nomos was a fellow called Anonymous Iamblichi. Interesting name. Let's read this part. He says, quote, another champion of Nomos and eunomia, law and order, is the so-called Anonymous Iamblichi, a writer apparently of the late 5th or early 4th century. His advice is aimed frankly at worldly success and may be summed up as virtue is the best policy and be what you would seem. He has taken a hint from Socrates, who, says Xenophon, always said that the best way to acquire a good name was to become what you wish to be thought to be. Socrates, however, would hardly have included a ready tongue among worthwhile ambitions, nor made fame the end and virtue only a means to attain it. The first necessity for success, says the writer, is to be born with natural gifts, but he is no aristocratic advocate of birth and breeding, for he immediately adds that this is a matter of chance. What is in a man's own power is to show that he really desires the good, and to devote the time and labor necessary to acquiring it. For in contrast to the art of speaking, which can be quickly mastered, arete demands long time and effort. Like Protagoras, he sees both nature and practice as necessary, but he would evidently not have followed Protagoras in using techne, art, acquired skill, and arete interchangeably. and his dismiss of the art of speaking as something in which the pupil can in a short time rival the master is an almost Platonic hit at Sophists, who make rhetoric the staple of their curriculum. RT, on the other hand, is a matter of long nurture, of growing up in avoidance of evil in speech and action, and pursuing and achieving good by protracted effort. RT is here given the moral content which Socrates and Plato gave it. It consists in using one's other gifts, ready speech, cleverness, bodily strength, in the interests of law and justice. If they are put to a contrary use, it would be better not to have them. To achieve perfect arity is to be useful to or confer benefit upon the largest number of people, and this is best done not by such crude and in their outcome dubious methods as indiscriminate charity, but by assisting the laws and justice, for it is they which create and preserve the union of human lives in political organizations. To achieve this calls for indifference to wealth, power, and life itself. The reward will be an unfailing good name. To think, he continues, of power-seeking as virtue and obedience to the laws as cowardice is pernicious. This attacks the kind of view represented by Plato's Callicles, but it was all too common in the late 5th century, and is equally exemplified by the assertion of Thucydides, that in the general transmutation of values, reckless aggression was reckoned courage, and moderation a screen for cowardice. The reason for this is Protagorean. Necessity forced men to combine for survival, and communal life is impossible without submission to law. Hence, law and justice must be supreme. Their strength is established by nature. On the surface, this seems to resolve the Nomos Physis antithesis by identifying the two on the basis of the same facts which Protagoras had adduced. Men's nature, physical weakness, would have brought them to destruction without political organization. Therefore, laws are an ordinance of nature. But the reconciliation could only be accepted by a superficial mind. Protagoras, like other evolutionary theorists more conscious of the ages of suffering and experience endured in the gradual and painful advance toward civilization, could not see law itself as a provision of nature. Nature gave men only the intelligence which enabled them, as a tardy alternative to destruction, to organize themselves in this way. There is no disagreement of substance between the two accounts, and a genuine reconciliation between Nomos and Physis could only be effected, as Plato effected it, by seeing in nature not a series of accidents, but the product of a supreme designing mind. Suppose, goes on the Anonymous, that a Superman could exist. Grant him a body and soul of steel, exemption from the ills of the flesh, and a total lack of human feeling. Even such a one could not continue to tyrannize with impunity, for all men would be his enemies, and through their allegiance to law would overcome him by combined force or skill. It is not, as many believe, the strength and violence of the tyrant that brings him to power, but the folly of the citizens themselves, for only a city that has already lost its respect for law and order can fall into his clutches. The extract concludes with a eulogy of the blessings of good government. Mutual trust, which Socrates also saw as the fruit of obedience to law, encourages commerce and the free circulation of money, and the rich can enjoy their wealth in tranquility, and the poor are helped by the more fortunate. Men enjoy peace of mind and freedom to follow their private pursuits, untroubled by war or internal dissension, and protected from tyranny. Law, says this democratic sympathizer, benefits the whole people. End quote. Okay, so that was a sort of longer section, but he's talking about the champion of Nomos, who is known as Anonymous Iamblichi. And he writes about arity, or virtue, as being something which is taught over a long period of time, over a lifetime. It's not the sort of thing that's learned quickly, but it's passed on through mastering customs and supporting law and order. He says arity is a matter of long nurture, of growing up in avoidance of evil in speech and action, and pursuing and achieving good by protracted effort. Erudite is here given the moral content. It consists of using one's gifts in the interests of law and justice. To achieve perfect arete is to be useful to or confer benefit upon the largest number of people. Almost utilitarian, but it's benefiting other people, right? Through your arete, you're benefiting society. Through your virtue, you're benefiting society, and you're strengthening your city and your civilization, your society. And he does sort of talk as though it's a social contract. He says, necessity forced men to combine for survival, and communal life is impossible without submission to law. Hence, law and justice must be supreme. Law and justice is what holds us together in societies, and we combine into societies for our own survival. And so, for that reason, we can't allow our dedication to law and justice to dissolve into chaos, because we will no longer have the protection from utter destruction that society provides us with. And this is a connection between Physis and Nomos. He says the strength of law and justice is established by nature. On the surface, this seems to resolve the Nomos-Physis antithesis, because basically men's nature would have brought them to destruction without political organization. It's not our nature to be out in the wild in an uncivilized manner. We don't survive well in that manner. We're not cut out for that. It's in our nature to be social creatures. And so this pushes the concept back from the mythology, which said that man originally didn't have societies, and then you say, well, actually it's part of our nature to have societies, and there's a sort of reconciliation, law and nature, between Nomos and Physis. But he says that's only a sort of superficial look, because really, if you're honest about it, nature gave men the intelligence to create a society, but didn't give us a society itself. And humans used their natural intelligence to create a society, if you want to get specific. And the author here, Guthrie, says that genuine reconciliation between Nomos and Physis could only be effected as Plato effected it, by seeing in nature not a series of accidents, but the product of a supreme designing mind. At any rate, he says that even if there was a person who's like a Superman, extremely powerful person who came to power, he couldn't really win, because weaker men would combine themselves to prevent him from being a tyrant. Tyrants only exist when people allow them to come to power, because people combined can always prevent a tyrant or a evil person or even a man made of steel could prevent him from seizing power if they pooled their resources and decided to do so. And so this really is like the supremacy of custom, the supremacy of law and order in the shape of human society, and its existence being a good thing that keeps people from destroying themselves in the state of nature. Sort of social contract theory a little bit. Then on the other side, there's the champion of Physis, who we've seen mentioned a few times, Callicles. And about Callicles, he says, quote, Callicles is a somewhat mysterious figure, for apart from his appearance as a character in Plato's dialogue, he has left no trace in recorded history. Yet he is described with an amount of authentic detail, which makes it difficult to believe that he is fictitious. Probably he existed, and was known to have held views of the kind which Plato ascribes to him, though in his anxiety to present in all its brutality the case that he wishes to demolish, Plato may well have taken elements from different sources and built up, in the person of Callicles, a somewhat stylized presentation of the doctrine might is right, in its most extreme form. He is a wealthy and aristocratic young man, just entering on public life, and though acting as host to Gorgias, no sophist himself. He dismisses those who profess to educate men in arete as a worthless lot, and would certainly blush as hotly as young Hippocrates in the Protagoras at the thought of joining their profession. His aristocratic and oligarchic connections are indicated by his liaison with Demos, the son of Plato's stepfather Pyrilampes, and friendship with Andron, who was one of the 400 set up in the oligarchic revolution of 411, and his pride in his descent is mentioned. Callicles takes up the argument with Socrates after the discomfiture of Gorgias's young and impetuous pupil Polus, who had tried to maintain the same thesis as Thrasymachus, that many achieve happiness through injustice. Like Thrasymachus, also Polus chose tyrants, Archelaus of Macedon, the great king of Persia, as his examples. They are without doubt evildoers, but if the wicked can escape punishment, they are prosperous and happy. By calling them wicked, as Callicles points out, he has played into Socrates' hands, for he has enough conventional morality left in him to agree that, whereas wickedness is a good thing for the wicked man, it is nevertheless dishonorable and blameworthy. Nonsense, says Callicles. Polus was wrong to grant Socrates his contention that to commit injustice was more blameworthy than to suffer it. That is the conventional view, but to put it forward as the true one is vulgar and mean. Nature and convention are generally in opposition, so that if a man is prevented by shame from saying what he thinks, he is compelled to contradict himself. Those who establish the conventions and make the laws are the weaker, that is, the majority. It is they who say that self-advancement is disgraceful and unjust, and equate injustice with the wish to have more than others. Nature says it is just for the better to have more than the worse, and the more powerful than the less powerful. End quote. So Callicles is a little bit more hardcore that might is right, that nature provides the strong with more things. It's right for the more powerful to have more stuff. The existence of hierarchy, the expression of power, is right and just through nature. And he's presented as sort of a foil for Plato. We don't know too much about him. We're just going on what Plato says. But nonetheless, it represents a view that was present in the ancient world. And now I want to talk a little bit about nature and necessity here, where he says, quote, "They say that to do wrong is in itself desirable, but to suffer it is not, and the harm of suffering injury outweighs the advantage of doing it. Experience has proved the difficulty of seizing the fruits of wrongdoing and escaping the harm. So, as a compromise, men made laws and agreements binding themselves to do neither. What these prescribed they called lawful and just. This is the origin and nature of justice, and it is valued not as good in itself, but through the lack of power to do wrong with impunity. A man capable of practicing injustice with consistent success would be mad to allow himself to be bound by such pacts. Imagine a man endowed with the fabled ring of Gyges, which by conferring invisibility on the wearer at his pleasure enabled him to escape the consequences of his acts. It would completely obliterate the distinction between the good and the wicked, for no one could resist the temptation to steal, commit adultery, and indulge in every sort of profitable or pleasurable wickedness. Goodness or justice is never practiced from choice, but only from necessity, under the fear of suffering injury oneself. Thus what matters is not, in fact, to be, but to appear just. To compare the lives of the just and unjust man, we must look at them in their pure form, each perfect in his way. The one who has perfected his wickedness will obviously not be caught. That would brand him as a botcher, but will go through life with an untarnished reputation for integrity. Conversely, the perfectly just man must not have the credit for his virtue. That would bring him honor and riches, and one could never be sure that he was not virtuous for the sake of these perquisites rather than of virtue itself. His virtue must be tested by suffering throughout life, an undeserved reputation for wickedness. It is not hard to predict the fate of the two men. The perfectly just will be taught by prison, torture, and execution that he has chosen the wrong path, while the perfectly unjust will be blessed with wealth, friends, and prosperity of every kind, and even enjoy the favor of the gods through being able to offer them the most lavish sacrifices. Here, Adeimantus joins in to add that Glaucon's case is only strengthened by the arguments of those who counsel justice, since they commend it not for its own sake, but only for the reputation and rewards that it brings, honor from men and blessings from heaven in this world and the next, and deprecate injustice as leading to punishment and misery, including posthumous torments in Hades. Everyone pays lip service to justice as a fine thing, but they add that it is hard and laborious, whereas self-indulgence and injustice are easy to practice, and only apparently and by convention or nomos disgraceful. Even the gods give a miserable life to many just men, and can be swayed by sacrifices, rites, and incantations into condoning and even assisting the injuries inflicted by the wicked. These views are offered as those of the ordinary run of mankind. We should not therefore expect to find any heroic Calliclean advocacy of the powerful and unscrupulous Superman, nor do we. Instead, we have a rather sordid mixture of greed, envy, pettiness, and fear. Everyone would take an unjust action of his fellows if he could, but though to live justly is an evil, it is a necessary one. True, the only important thing is to appear just, but since the Ring of Gyges is only a fairy tale, this involves keeping, on the whole, within the bounds of law and conventional morality. The perfectly unjust man is an unattainable ideal. These views are offered as those of the ordinary run of mankind. We should not therefore expect to find any heroic Calliclean advocacy of the powerful and unscrupulous Superman, nor do we. Instead, we have a rather sordid mixture of greed, envy, pettiness, and fear. Everyone would take an unjust advantage of his fellows if he could, but, though to live justly is an evil, it is a necessary one. True, the only important thing is to appear just, but since the Ring of Gyges is only a fairy tale, this involves keeping on the whole within the bounds of law and conventional morality. The perfectly unjust man is an unattainable ideal. Self-interest, says Glaucon, is what every nature, or physis, naturally pursues as a good, though law or convention, nomos, constrains it to diverge into respect for equality. This is the kind of realism or fact-facing which we meet in Thucydides, in the oft-repeated statement that it is human nature to do wrong and dominate others wherever possible, and in the Sophist Gorgias. It is not in nature for the strong to be thwarted by the weaker, but for the weaker to be ruled and led by the stronger, for the strong to lead and the weak to follow. The factual or amoral character of the current attitude to human behavior is emphasized when, as often, we find nature coupled with the idea of necessity. In the Melian dialogue, the Athenians claim that the rule of the stronger occurs by natural necessity, and this and similar phrases are a reminder of the influence on ethics of the natural science of the day. Necessity, ananke, as a cosmological force, runs right through pre-Socratic thought in the Western tradition, Parmenides, Empedocles, the Pythagoreans, with almost mystical or theological overtones, but in Ionian rationalism, which reached its culmination in Leucippus and Democritus, appearing as a mindless natural force, equated with the chance collisions of the atoms and the cosmic vortices which they form. Two passages in the Clouds of Aristophanes parody the jargon of the scientists and illustrate the way in which it was transferred to human life as justification for immorality. Ananke fills the clouds with moisture and governs the motions by which they collide and cause thunder, and the author of this necessity is no longer a personal Zeus, but the celestial whirl. Later in the play, The unjust argument speaks of the necessities of nature with reference to adultery, and calls shamelessness and self-indulgence exercising one's nature. Democritus himself made the transfer to human life in a less provocative way when he said that the begetting of children is looked upon as one of the necessities arising from nature. This association of necessity with nature is used as an argument by the opponents of Nomos, which they represent as an attempt to thwart natural forces that is rightly doomed to failure. Thus, in Antiphon, we read, in a passage setting forth the advantages of breaking the law if one can escape detection, that the dictates of law are artificially imposed by human agreement, whereas those of nature are necessary, just because they have grown up naturally. And in emphasizing our common humanity against the artificiality of racial distinctions, he speaks of breathing and eating as activities which are naturally necessary to all men. In a fragment of Euripides, the necessary simply replaces physis as the contrary of nomos. The conclusion to be drawn is that since the laws of nature are inexorable and apply to humanity no less than to the world at large, men will inevitably follow them unless prevented by the intervention of nomos. End quote. So that was a long section there about nature and necessity, but before I actually got to the section of nature and necessity, there was some that I read at the start of that section about Glaucon and the ring of Gyges, which I just wanted to append that to that section because that's a very well-known part of Plato, and the point that Glaucon is trying to make is that if there wasn't any punishment for being unjust, if you really knew that you could do unjust things, and you really knew that you could completely escape detection, everybody would do unjust things. Let's say there must be some, I think we can agree that there would be some constraint that people would impose upon themselves, and how much of that is their socialization kicking in, and how much of it is a real moral revulsion at certain acts. I guess I don't really believe that we are all completely unjust people, that we don't have any sort of hardwired sense of justice, that justice itself is completely a social convention. But the author is saying that the view of people at the time was really that because there's no way of being completely just on your own, that everyone is driven towards injustice, the only way that they can act just is through society imposing nomos, or laws, or customs, right? The ring of Gyges is a fairy tale, and everybody is constrained to some greater or lesser degree by the decrees of society in how they should and shouldn't behave. There's no escaping it. There's no ring of Gyges. There's no escaping society and its demands that it places upon us. This idea that the pursuit of self-interest is every person's nature, every person's physis, and people only pursue good through convention, that's a sort of view of human nature that's echoed in Thucydides and is echoed elsewhere. And this is tied to the idea of nature, the combination of nature and necessity, that the strong rule the weaker by necessity. People act in their self-interest by necessity. The way that people are by nature is the way that they are by necessity. But then it seems as though nomos is set against necessity, and if nomos is able to overcome necessity, then How necessary is it? The last line of that section I quoted, he says, the conclusion to be drawn is that since the laws of nature are inexorable and apply to humanity no less than to the world at large, men will inevitably follow them, unless prevented by the intervention of Nomos. Well, they can't be inexorable, can they? If they can be prevented by the intervention of Nomos, man will inevitably follow them unless prevented by the intervention of Nomos. But it seems to me that Nomos must be constrained just as much as Physis by the laws of necessity. So I'm going to close out here with a discussion of natural law and unwritten law, and what was meant by unwritten law back in the ancient world. He says, quote, "To sum up a complex situation, the term unwritten laws was applied in the first place to certain moral principles believed to be universally valid, or alternatively, valid all over the Greek world. Their authors were the gods, and no breach of them could remain unpunished. They were already closely connected with the natural world, for to contrast man with nature, instead of seeing him as a part of it, is a modern rather than a Greek habit. So, for instance, Heraclitus, who spoke of all human laws being nourished by one divine law, also said that if the sun left his course, the Furies, agents of Dike, would find him out. In contrast to these ordinances of heaven, each country or city had its own nomoi. It made laws to suit its own beliefs and needs, laws which had no force elsewhere, and in their own land might be altered to suit changed circumstances. In general, it would be thought just or right to observe these laws, but they had not the scope or force of the divine or natural laws, and to the questing minds of the sophistic age it was matter for debate how far dikaion and nomenon coincided, the answer depending very much on whether or not a speaker was prepared to include the divine nomoi under the latter head. A second meaning of unwritten law, derived from the ambiguity of the word nomos. Since it meant the customs of a country as well as its law, unwritten nomoi stood for what was believed in that country to be right and equitable, but could not, in practice, be included in the corpus of written law. Yet it would be taken into account in judging a particular case. By the middle of the 5th century, a secular trend of thought is gaining ground at the expense of the theistic, which did not, however, by any means disappear completely. Side by side with it appears an impersonal nature, whose decrees are absolute, and their neglect as inevitably punished, as those of the gods had been. But they do not necessarily follow the precepts of traditional morality, for under the influence of mechanistic scientific theories, the natural world is no longer subject to moral government. The effect is seen in Antiphon, for whom pleasure is the natural goal, and the old, divine, unwritten law that parents should be honored is often contrary to nature. For Callicles, the law of nature, which every man should follow who has the strength and determination to do so, justified the crudest hedonism and the most outrageous tyranny. The decline of religious sanctions coincided with the rise of democratic government, for which positive written law appeared as a safeguard against the return of tyranny or oligarchy based on the new conception of nature's law. The latter was perforce unwritten, and so, finally, the concept of unwritten law took on a sinister meaning and was banished in the modern, more nearly egalitarian society. This was the state of the question when Plato took it over. At one extreme, the equality of all citizens under a written and published code of law. At the other, the ideal of the strong man, nature's hero, who spurns the law in his march to absolute and selfishly exercised power. To both of these, Plato opposed first his conception of nature itself as an intelligent and moral force, and secondly, his vision of the wise, enlightened, and trained ruler master of the science of government, whose rules would inevitably benefit his people. Such a one would do better without written laws, imposing the fruits of his scientific understanding on subjects willing or unwilling, killing or banishing when necessary for the health of the city as a whole. Even the docile young Socrates is moved to a protest at this point. Codified law is only a set of clumsy rules of thumb, which cannot allow for the infinite variety of particular cases. A magistrate who governs by it, as compared with the true statesman, will be like a layman trying to cure a patient by looking up the disease in a book, compared to a skilled and experienced physician using his expert judgment. This drastic conclusion is considerably modified when Plato goes on to admit that in the absence of the ideal statesman, a good code of laws provides the best imitation of his rule, and in all ordinary states must be drawn up and enforced with the utmost rigor. End quote. So he's saying that there was not really the strict, like he opens up saying there was not really the strict division between nature and society. Oddly, because he's been talking about this conflict between them, but he does sort of say here in this section that the stark contrast between society and nature is more of a modern way of looking at things, that in the ancient Greek world there was more of a connection between laws and nature, and it was bound in with their mythology. And he quotes Heraclitus, who spoke of all human laws being nourished by one divine law, and that if the sun left its course, agents of Dike would find him out. In other words, again, we see the moral quality of nature, the law-like quality of nature, and its bounds and beyond its ordained bounds. If the sun should leave its ordained course, that the Furies would find it out, that it would be subject, the sun itself would be subject to the laws of nature and fate and necessity, with a sort of moral quality, that the sun would be transgressing should it leave its ordained course. So there is a sense of the contiguousness of human law and natural law. And there's also the idea that there are unwritten laws that are like the social customs of a people that are not actually literally codified into law, but are still norms of behavior, can also be referred to as the unwritten laws. But at any rate, there's a lot of back and forth about it, where one person says that honoring one's parents, says pleasure is the natural goal, and honoring one's parents is often contrary to nature. So in some cases, the mechanistic scientific study of nature, with more of a disregard for the gods, and instead looking at the world as the seeking of pleasure. There is in this early Greek philosophy, there is a sort of mechanistic, materialistic quality to some of it, and in that mechanistic quality, there is conflict with the traditional morality, the traditional customs, the traditional ways of doing things, the traditional nomos. And so it's interesting. It's just like in some ways they're opposed. Physis and nomos are opposed. In other ways they're related. There's no real. I don't think there's any real conclusion in the Sophists, and there's certainly more to discuss about the Sophists when it comes to things like relativism and values and rhetoric and all the other components of what the Sophists were talking about. But that's for another day. Today I just wanted to point out, I guess, the importance of the discussion that never seemed to reach an adequate conclusion about how Physis and Nomos relate to one another, and it's still a question that we ask today, and I think evolutionary psychology is providing us with better answers than we have ever really had before. It's the strongest guide that we have currently to understanding human society, I believe. So thank you for tuning in, and I'll talk to you again next time.